Shalom and warm welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing something that really hasn't come to light before, and this is Messianic Jews caught up in the Holocaust, and this is their story. Well, welcome to the program, and today's special guest is all the way from Australia. He's an author, a researcher, and a reluctant historian, and his name is Kelvin Crombie. Kelvin, it's great to see you again. And when I was going through my notes of when you were last on the Middle East Report, I can't believe it was actually 5 years ago this week that you were last here to discuss the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and here you are talking about what I would only describe as a kind of hidden history, that of the plight of Messianic Jewish believers who went through the Holocaust during the Second World War. So it's great to see you.
Thank you, Simon. It's good to be here again.
Likewise. Now, before we start, I know that you're here and being sponsored by CMJ, that's the Christian Ministry to the Jews. And you are here to do a speaking engagement. So I've got a little bit of announcements to make regarding this because of Jane, who's works for CMJ. And the first one is Bible Come to Life exhibition, and that's in your church, organised by Paul and Jane Hames. And that's an Israel tour in November called Wine and Cheese Tour. Should be interesting. So if you love your wine, you love your cheese, that's a tour. And for the historians among you, there's a CMJ Pilgrim Fathers Tour. It's taking place from the 10th to 18th of September 2022, and that's with Jane and Chris Mogson, and that's throughout the UK. I'll just give you that one. So we are Pilgrim Fathers, the Mayfair, everything else, which is started. And before me in front of these are loads of Kelvin's books. Kelvin, what you've written, I mean, in terms of this book here, which I'm going to read it out, which is Jewish Christians in the Netherlands during the Holocaust. There's that one. You have another book here called Jewish Christian Victims of the Holocaust. And one more you're writing on about the plight of French Messianic believers during the Holocaust as well. I mean, this is something that I don't know anyone who's covered this historical topic before. So can you tell us the story behind why you decided to research this, how you decided to research this? Because clearly God has given you a very special mandate to do this.
Well, it all actually began after the big event in 2017 at the Royal Albert Hall. As you remember, we had that big event. And
you did a great job on it.
Well, it was a great event. It was a pleasure to be involved. And my role there was to speak about not just the Balfour Declaration, but also the role of the British and the Australian New Zealand forces winning that battle in Beersheba on the same day, incidentally, and the combination of the two. And it was a high point. Well, those events don't come along, so often. But afterwards, as we were walking to the hotel, it was very interesting. I just sensed the Holy Spirit just speaking to me and saying something like, Kelvin, that's it, job done. I'd been involved in all this sort of research, primarily in Israel, working at Christchurch and CMJ for 25, 30 or so years. And to be told by the Lord, well, that's it, job done, you think, oh, okay, I'd like to sort of hang around a bit and sort of soak up the atmosphere. But I had enough experience of the Lord's leading until that point of time that when He speaks, you sort of just have to say, okay, well, what's next? And the what's next didn't happen for a while, until about March of the next year, 2018, when a very close friend of mine called David Pelleggi, who's the minister at Christchurch in Jerusalem, he had actually been on my case for a number of years about this subject of what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus during the Holocaust. He'd been dropping hints for a number of years. I wasn't picking up the hints and a few other things on my plate. But then I think it was about March or April I just had that sense, yes, David had a few things he wanted me to do, research-wise, but that was one thing that really struck a chord with me, and I thought, yes, that's it. And as I've often experienced in my own life as a researcher and doing speaking on these sorts of subjects, that when the Lord gives a project, gives something to do, He actually then provides everything you need. So suddenly I began to find materials in my own little library back in Perth, Western Australia, I'd forgotten that I even had. Suddenly I found these couple of books, and from there you go to the website, then you realise there's other books, and nowadays you can order them or you can download them, and suddenly there was quite a bit of material. David Pileggi's vision had been basically to determine how many and what happened to these Jewish people who followed Jesus in the Holocaust. Because oftentimes when you read through the sources, they'll talk about the converts. Okay, if you're reading through the secular sources, they'll talk about the converts here and the converts there. Not always in the best of terms, incidentally. But if you read autobiographies of survivors, etc., they would call themselves Hebrew Christians, etc., etc. So I began to realise early on that it wasn't just a matter of one or two. It wasn't just a matter of the people who survived and wrote their life stories, and there are a few, thankfully, or others who wrote about Jewish followers of Jesus who perished. There was actually a large number. And the more research I began to do, with help from David and other people like Richard Harvey over here and Mitch Glaser in the United States, you're also very interested in the subject matter. The more I began to realise there's actually quite a large number, quite a large group of Jewish followers of Jesus during the Holocaust. Now, the important thing was to realise that in that period of time they weren't called Messianic Jews. They were called either Hebrew Christians or Jewish Christians, excuse me, and converts, Meshumadim, which means traitors. But collectively they were called Jewish followers of Jesus. And the Nazis had a particular term as well. They called them non-Aryan Christians. And it's important to realise where that title comes from, because for them they wanted to make sure that Germany was a pure Aryan society. So anybody in Germany and the Greater Reich, when they took over Austria and Czechoslovakia, anybody who wasn't a pure Aryan, had to be sort of ousted. And there was a problem. What about those Jewish people, fully Jewish, who are involved in the church? Because the Nazi worldview was that all institutions in Germany were to further the Nazi worldview. Well, the church would be an important avenue, wouldn't it? Because most Germans then were baptised into the Roman Catholic Church or any of the Protestant churches. And so they wanted to, in a sense, utilise the church to be an avenue to further the Nazi worldview. Well, there's a bit of a problem here, because you had Jewish people in there who weren't Aryans in the church. Couldn't be. And so they wanted to get rid of those, that group. And it was, in Germany, it was quite a sizable group of people who were involved, Jewish people who were involved in the church. Quite a few pastors.
Do you have any idea of numbers?
Well, let's say there were thousands, many thousands. A lot of people are interested in the numbers. It's very, very difficult to determine the numbers.
Of course.
But it's important, therefore, just to sort of look at the various principles that were there, and every now and again some numbers. And when I get to speaking about the Dutch situation, we do actually have some numbers there, which took a bit of frolicking around to find. So in the midst of doing all this particular research in time, and that involved coming over to Europe on 3 occasions and going to locations, on-site locations in Poland, but also all over Europe, except for Ukraine and Belarus. I was supposed to go there in 2020, but didn't quite make it. And going through the archives, we went through the various archives. On one occasion, I think I did a 6-week tour or so, and I don't know how many archives I went to in UK, Canada, USA, and places like that, of organisations who had been involved with Jewish people in Europe. But then you began to see there's quite a few institutions that were involved in Jewish ministry. And in the 1930s, it was very, very clear to see that, I would say, in hindsight, that the Lord was actually really spreading the message of Jesus throughout Europe. More and more organisations were going out and spreading the message of Jesus. But in the midst of all that, all those materials that were being collected, I began to see that there's there's a few categories of Jewish followers of Jesus, or groups. It's hard to describe, we're talking about people. How do you put people into a sort of a group? But it's not just all converts or all non-Aryan Christians. There was different types. For instance, there were those who, before the war began, were genuine followers of Jesus, who made a heart commitment to follow Jesus as the Messiah. But then in Europe, in the 1920s and 30s, many times for a Jewish person to actually get a particular job or position in society, he or she would actually have to become Gentilized, assimilated. That often meant also being baptized into the Roman Catholic Church in Poland or the Lutheran Church and so on and so forth. And so there were quite a few people, therefore, who were what I call socio-economic converts, if you want to use that word. And there were quite a few people who entered the church, were baptized and became Christians for love, basically, because they were marrying a Gentile spouse. And so oftentimes then, well, I would just become a Roman Catholic or a Greek Orthodox or, whatever, a Protestant. And so that's another sort of a group. Now, some of those might have become or might have been genuine followers of Jesus, but the rationale for them actually entering into the church was because they were marrying a Gentile or a Christian person. Then another group would be those who were the children of the first three groups. I mean, even though the grandparents might have been true followers of Jesus 30, 40 years ago, it doesn't mean to say that the son or the grandson, some years later is going to be following on. So, they could be assimilated, could be involved in the church, but may not actually be a genuine follower of Jesus. And also the children and grandchildren of those other two categories. So there's another group that were there. And a lot of those people had no idea at all of their Jewishness. There's testimonies in the book we just finished on the Netherlands, for instance. There's a whole family, 6 of them who are actually Trappists or Trappistines. And they virtually had no idea that they were Jewish, because their parents had been and had become followers of Jesus, entered into the Roman Catholic Church. So most of those went to Auschwitz, not even knowing really why they were going there. Oh. They really had no idea. No substantial idea that they were going because they were Jewish. Okay, so that's another group. And so then you have, during the war itself, you have those who were baptized, converted and baptized into the church, because that was basically the only way of surviving. And there were times when churches actually would do that, put them through the catechism, a quick catechism sometimes, in order to make sure that they could get a baptismal certificate and have a better chance of surviving. Now, it has to be said that in the Nazi worldview, your faith didn't mean a bean, didn't mean a thing. It was all to do with your bloodline. Yeah. So it did help in some situations, some occasions, but most definitely not on all occasions. And then another group was the children. And there were many times when Jewish children were placed into the custodianship of Christian families or even Christian institutions for their safety. And sometimes those children would have been baptized, etc., in order that they would assimilate and fit in better. Now, after the war, that was quite problematic because many times the parents had not survived. And so some of the Jewish institutions were then going around trying to find these children. Some of them might not have wanted to go back to the Jewish community, and on other occasions, the institution or the host family might not have wanted to give them up. So that was a problematic one. And the last group are those Jewish people who had a genuine experience with the Lord Jesus during the war itself. And we know in the Netherlands, for instance, that happened quite a bit. There were quite a few Jewish people who were in hiding and had to sort of adopt a Christian facade, so to speak, but some actually had genuine faith experiences. In the Netherlands, for instance, there were so many that after the war, they actually founded an organisation called Derech, the Way, in order to be able to give some nourishment to all these younger, particularly younger Jewish people who actually came to faith in Jesus as Messiah. So that's 7, sort of you might say, different groupings, for want of a better word, of non-Aryan Christians or Jewish Christians during the context of the war. So when reading through all these materials, it was important for me to try to find a bit of the context, or where do they fit in, what's their storyline. And as I said before, for the Nazi authorities, it really didn't matter which church they belonged to and how involved they were in a church beforehand. If they were Jewish, if their grandparents were Jewish, if their bloodline was Jewish, that was it.
And of course, you produced this book here, which you're holding up now, which is your latest book, Jewish Christians in the Netherlands During the Holocaust. I mean, what's so fascinating about this is that when we look at the Holocaust, and in recent years, we've had so many books written about it, documentaries produced about the Holocaust. We've had Hollywood films produced about the Holocaust. We've never been so saturated with the Holocaust narrative as we do now. And of course, with International Holocaust Memorial Day each January on January the 27th, another opportunity to be reminded of the horrors that took place. But never before came across the concept of Jewish Christians or Messianics, this is probably a better term to call them today, and to think that they actually went through the Holocaust. So it's an incredible study. But can you share with us what you found out on your travels? Tell us the story of how you found the documentation, the people involved, and some of their stories, because I was listening to one of your excellent Zoom events with Jane last night, just to give a little bit of a background information. I was listening to one in France, and I didn't know personally about the German Madagascar plan to round up as many Jewish people and take them to Madagascar, one massive big concentration camp. So share with us how some of these incredible stories of how the Messianic Jews were rounded up with the rest of the Jewish community to their deaths, sent to the gas chambers such as Auschwitz and Birkenau.
Well, I'll explain that in a second if you don't mind, but you talked about the Madagascar plan. Now you, like myself, didn't know much about the Madagascar plan. And probably you, like me and many others, had this impression that from the very get-go, the Nazis had a plan to murder all the Jewish people. And that's how I sort of perceive things. I don't think actually it was that case. That came quite later. And there were 7 stages. I've worked out personally from my own research model that there were 7 stages, or phases is probably a better word, of the Holocaust. And there was, first of all, the period up until 1933. You know, the Nazis didn't rock up on the 30th of January 1933 and say, here we are, incidentally, we don't like Jewish people, right? There had been a foundation laid beforehand. Their own worldview was established, but society and trends within society, Hitler's own personality type and experience, there's a whole range of things that made up that Nazi worldview. It's important to look at those. Absolutely. And the second phase was 1933 to 1939, what I call the intimidation, exploitation and immigration phase. And this is primarily within Germany and the Reich. And as I explained earlier on, that was when the whole concept of non-Aryan Christians came into vogue. And their goal then was to get rid of the Jewish people from living there. Okay? And Jewish people were killed, there's no doubt about that, especially in Kristallnacht. But the goal was to get as many out as possible. Then when the war began, of course, that basically stopped. And then the war in Poland, of course, meant that now the German authorities had another 3 million or so Jewish people under their jurisdiction. But what are we going to do with this mob, all these people? They were different. They looked different. They behaved different to the German Jews. But they still had to work out what they're going to do with them. And so the goal then was to round them up and put them in a particular area of Poland around the city of Lublin. It's called the Lublin Plan. And they were going to call that Little Judea or something like that. And then in the interim, they put them into ghettos. Now, that meant Jewish Christians as well. Jewish followers of Jesus were involved in that phase as well. And that was going to be the final, the solution at the time. That didn't work out. And then they took over the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Now, another 550,000 Jewish people under their jurisdiction. What are we going to do with them? So that's when the whole idea of the Madagascar plan, which had been around for many years, came back. The Nazis adopted it, the Foreign Office adopted it, and that meant we were going to send them all to the island of Madagascar. But first, let's defeat France. France is defeated. Now they had to defeat the country of the shopkeepers, which is you mob, okay, because you ruled the waves. So until they could defeat Britain, they couldn't send not just the 550,000 Jewish people of those countries, but now they were going to send all 4 million Jewish people under their jurisdiction to the island of Madagascar. And a man called Adolf Eichmann was entrusted, another guy called Thomas Dannecker, with actually formulating this plan. And it was a serious plan. Okay? Even to the point where they stopped building the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto because the commander over there in Warsaw said, well, why do it? Because you're all going to Madagascar. Okay, so it was serious.
So can I just stop you there, because I just need to bring in something important. Was it just to detain the Jewish people, or were they being sent? Was there going to be a kind of death camps?
A massive ghetto. No, there was no death camps at that stage. There were concentration camps, there were ghettos, there were transit camps, whatever you want to, work camps. There were no death camps. That only actually started happening towards the end of 1941. Madagascar was going to be one big colony under SS controls. It wouldn't have been a holiday. It wouldn't have been a holiday place, but nevertheless, the idea was to get all 4 million there. Now that wasn't going to work because Britain wasn't defeated. So when they went into the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, then went to another plan, and they were given commission to murder Jewish men until a certain age. And it's all to do with what they call the Commissar's Order, but we won't go into the details. But then on the 31st of July 1941, there was a particular letter that went to the Nazi commander in which he was given jurisdiction to deal with the Jewish situation. And thereafter, it was reported that not just Jewish men were being shot by the murder squads called the Einsatzgruppen, now Jewish women and children were also being shot. So there was a change that was going on in from August of 1941. So, and that really got to the point of in Kiev, for instance, Babi Yar, where about 34,000, I think, Jewish people were shot in a space of a few days. So something was now going on. More and more Jewish people were being shot in Belarus and in Ukraine. And they get towards the end of 1941, it's very, very difficult for me to actually speak about this, whereby the Nazi leaders were realizing it was getting bad for the mental health of the executioners. We have to find another form of mass execution. That's when they began to experiment with gas fans, and the gas fans went into the gas chambers. Okay, so that was all happening now towards the end of 41. So already it was in their mind what they wanted to do. That's what I call phase 6. Phase 7 was the Wannsee Conference, 20th of January 1942, whereby they brought in all the different institutions of the German government, basically. The Ministry of the Health, or the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Foreign Ministry, they'd all be involved. So it wouldn't be seen to be just an SS thing. And there it was decided that they would murder 11 million Jewish people in Europe and surrounding areas. Now we know of 6 million that were murdered, but the plan was to actually murder 11 million. And that was a very, very serious conference in this place called Wannsee House. So thereafter, no Jewish person, no person had who was Jewish heritage would survive. That was it. That was the plan, and that was the decision. So thereafter, it was just a matter of implementing. And so the death camps were being established. You had Auschwitz, which was already there previously. Then you had Chełmno, which was a place for Western Poland. Then you had Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor, all built as death camps, basically. And so that was basically the background. So Jewish followers of Jesus, with some exceptions, Jewish followers of Jesus throughout Europe would actually be taken away as well. And so in the midst of all that, it's dark. Listen, it's dark. I can't put any other description that this is a very dark subject. There were so many times when I struggled. But every now and again, there was some light. Every now and again, you'd find something and you say, oh, wow, this is incredible. And for instance, with the Polish situation, that book was based upon a family called Basili and Anna Joch, and there's several generations. And as I managed to actually track down the son, or the grandson of the gentleman on the picture, and the son of one of them. His name was Philip Joch, and he was still living in Toronto. And so I went to Toronto to do some research there and tracked down this son, and he had a whole box of stuff about his family, and they were in Poland, and some died and many survived. But then he came out and he had a big file, probably about that thick, and it was all full of German material. And he said, I don't know what to do with this. I thought of throwing it away. What? And I had a look. I don't know much German, but when you're a researcher, you just sort of, your antennae go up. So I went through this stuff, and I could see dates and all sorts of things and information. And thankfully, David Pileggi's daughter-in-law, Deborah, was able to translate that material for me. I photographed it and sent it to her. And the storyline basically is that Vasily Yoch and his wife Anna, they were in Lviv, and they hid basically. He was hidden in a woodshed for about 2.5 years, and she actually stayed in the house. She spoke perfect Polish, and so she could actually pretend she was actually a Polish lady. And there were German soldiers billeted in the house. Quite amazing.
Wow.
And they did this for a couple of years, but ultimately it came asunder, and the Germans found out about Vasily, and they came to pick him up, and they took him off, and they shot him the day after, I think it was. And they beat Anna up to the point where she was actually paralysed initially completely, and then later came to. And they managed to survive. One son actually got out before the war, actually was in England before the war. Not that he got out, he didn't know the war was happening, but he couldn't get back over again. Okay, Jacob Joch was his name, and he became a very, very important theologian. So what happened is, after the war, it was known, they survived and managed to get out. Jacob was over here. The mother came to live with Jacob. And after the war, Jacob Joch, by this stage, had moved to Canada. He heard the Germans were giving compensation to survivors of the Holocaust. So he said, listen, I've been looking after my mother for years. I'm getting nothing from the German government, from the British government. So he applied. Now, the German government is not just going to start giving, pensions and whatever else to anybody who submitted a form. So they had to check it out. So they had a lawyer involved, and also Jacob had to get somebody involved. So there's lots of correspondence. So the German government actually had to get a researcher to go and find out if all these details about his mother being beaten up and father being shot were true.
Wow.
So all that stuff was written down. So that's what you would basically call a primary source. So here's this file, chock-a-block full of all this sort of stuff. It's incredible. And so when I accessed that, got it translated, put it together with other information, because Jacob Joch had worked with CMJ. He'd actually been the pastor of the congregation that CMJ had in Warsaw. Quite a large congregation, incidentally. And so there was quite a bit of material began to come together. And so there you have a story of a survivor, basically. And there was light in that story, because another son, his name was, what's his name again? I'm having one of those senior moments. Okay, his name will come back shortly. 12 o'clock tonight, I'll get his name back again.
A bit too late for the programme, but...
That's all right. He also survived there in Lvov. And so you got these little testimonies coming through, how they survived. And the mother, Anna, a very, very quiet, unassuming sort of a lady. And she went through all that situation that came out, and their son, Jacob Joch, was one of the greatest Hebrew Christian scholars in the period after the war. And actually himself and others were involved in the Hebrew Christian Alliance. He actually was the president of the Hebrew Christian Alliance, which is now the Messianic Jewish Hebrew Christian Alliance. So there's one little testimony coming through, but there were others from Poland. Now, as far as the Netherlands is concerned, what I've done with that one, we've chosen some Jewish Catholics and a couple of Jewish Protestants, and try to tell the story through their history as well. And one of the Jewish Protestants, if I can use that name, they don't use those terms now, but that's basically how they would have been thought of as in that time. His name is Ernest Casuto, and he later became a pastor in the United States and has written a book called The Last Jew in Rotterdam, which is really worth a good read. And so his story basically is that he came to faith in Jesus during the war, because it got to a point he was an assimilated Jewish person. He didn't know. He can't go to the beach. Why not? He's Jewish. Can't go to a restaurant. Why not? He's Jewish. Well, what's a Jew mean? What's it mean to be a Jew? He didn't know really what it meant to be Jewish until somebody said, you can't do that because you were Jewish. So he wanted to find out what it meant to be Jewish. And as a result of that, I won't go into all the details, he came to know Jesus as the Messiah. Now, this was actually during the wars, but then he had to go into underground to hide, basically. And he survived, and it was quite a miracle how he survived. At the end of it, he became a pastor.
Amazing.
And so that's a wonderful testimony. But one of the people who had a big influence on him coming to faith in Jesus was a person called Johannes Rottenberg, who was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, and he is fully 100% Jewish. And he's actually associated with CMJ as well. And that's where I first heard about this man, okay, when I lived in Israel. One of my colleagues was a guy called Reuven Achimeah, and his grandfather used to go to the congregation that was being led by Johannes Rottenberg. So that's how I heard about him. And there was a particular work in Rotterdam called Elam, and it was a place where they established close to the port and administered to all the Jewish people who were coming to get on the boat to go to the New World. And so it was called Elam because it was an oasis, basically. And so Johannes Rottenberg came to faith in Jesus as the Messiah there, and then many years later he went back to the Netherlands and headed up the work. And during the beginning part of the war, he had actually spent a lot of his time going around and also speaking to the churches of their responsibility towards the Jewish people, to the point that many, many people then became alerted to this and then began to take Jewish people into their homes when the persecution really began. And I mean, he's Jewish, he's a pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church, and he didn't like the Nazi control over his country, so he began to speak out about it. Well, the Nazis actually had a system, they'd send in spies, okay, or people would go and listen to the sermons. And so him, and there was another Dutch Reformed minister called Jacob Cohen, they were preaching sermons that the Nazi authorities didn't particularly like. And so ultimately they were both arrested, and both of them died. Johannes Rottenberg, we followed this story all the way through. I actually had an incredible encounter some years ago when I was doing my research here. A lady called Esme Laurie, Tom and Esme Laurie. And through them, I heard of the existence of this man's son who lived in San Diego. So I was over in the States doing the research. I located him down in San Diego, David Rottenberg. He had some material, I had a good chat, and you get a bit more of the picture.
Amazing.
So in two situations, it was direct relatives of these people for the Polish story and for the Dutch story. And so as a result of that, you build up a bit of a picture. Because David Rottenberg was a young man in The Hague, Scheveningen at the time, who also witnessed his father being taken away, and realised not long afterwards that his father had perished. So Johannes Rottenberg was worked to death in Mauthausen concentration camp. Now this is before the deportations started taking place. They only started taking place in the middle of July. So he actually was killed beforehand, worked to death, okay, because he was a pastor that the Germans didn't like, but also because he was Jewish. So he had two things going against him. Now what we got in the testimony from this particular man is that there was somebody who had been in prison with him in the Netherlands called Amersfoort concentration camp before he was sent. And it was forbidden to actually have church services. Well, guess what Johannes Rottenberg goes and does? He has church services on Sundays, as too did Ernest Casuto when he was in Rotterdam prison. And so he got beaten up for it and got a bit of bad treatment, but nevertheless, he still went ahead and did it. And afterwards, he was sent to Buchenwald, and guess what he did in Buchenwald as well? He also had services.
Amazing.
Okay, an incredible testimony. And then he was sent ultimately to Mauthausen, and there was a testimony that somebody actually wrote that they know he brought at least one or two Jewish people to faith in Jesus as Messiah in the time he was in Mauthausen. But after the war, or close to being after the war, Mrs. Rottenberg Cornelia Rottenberg received a letter from somebody who had been in prison with him. And this particular person was actually specifically stating the things that this man Johannes Rottenberg was doing when he was there in that situation, and how he brought light into a dark situation. Wow. Now he died, but it was a great testimony. Amazing. Prior to him, being murdered, basically. So there are many, many such stories. I've only uncovered, I think, a few. And I think the thing about this project, Simon, is that we're not setting out to say that we've got all the answers, we know all the details, or we've got all the numbers. But I think if you start doing something like this, then suddenly it begins to open up more doors. Other people will then come forth with materials. And it is something which I think is extremely important for Jewish people themselves to actually hear about. Instead of just sort of passing off the converts to that side and thinking there was just a few. There weren't just a few. Okay, if you look at the whole thing of non-Aryan Christians, there were tens of thousands. You know, and we know that in the Netherlands, for instance, at least 420 Jewish Christians perished in the Holocaust.
Wow.
The majority, well, half, I suppose, were Catholic and half were Protestant. Now, that's only because that's a small number compared to the bigger number. But in the Netherlands, a lot of the churches actually took a strong stand. The church did take a strong stand against the Nazi authorities. It wasn't the same anywhere else. But I think one of the important things is to highlight this to the broader Jewish community, because there can be this negativity towards Jewish converts, Jewish people who follow Yeshua, Jesus. And they could say, you're no longer Jewish, etc., etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is, each and every one of those Jewish Christians, those non-Aryan Christians who died, and there were thousands, each and every one of them died not because of their faith, but because of their bloodline, because they're Jewish. So how can somebody say you're not really Jewish anymore when the fact of the matter is they perished like any other Jewish person? A lot of those other Jewish people they had no faith at all either. There could have been communists, there could have been atheists within the Jewish community. These people at least were following, the vast majority anyway, as far as we can see, the fact that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah.
And Kelvin, I suppose the big question that this actually brings up is, what difference did they make? We hear of a few righteous Gentiles that were Christians who loved the Jewish people, who died in the Holocaust with the Jewish people. I'm thinking, I can't remember her name now, but Harding, a Scottish missionary woman, for example, that was sent to the gas chambers because
Jane Haining.
Jane Haining, that's correct. I've done a few programs on this topic a long time ago. And these were the exception. But what difference would these Hebrew Christians or Messianic Jews make to their in the darkest and darkest of circumstances, to be in those concentration camps with death all around them, and to bring the fragrance of Christ or Yeshua HaMashiach into those death camps?
From what I have read, and there's a few other occasions, they brought light. Now, I'm not saying that each and every one of them brought light, but I'm sure there are many who brought light and hope and something there in the midst of that darkness. You've probably heard of Edith Stein. Okay, Edith Stein was a Roman Catholic, Jewish, brought up totally Jewish, and in her own conviction believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and the stream of Christianity she wanted to join was the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. And she perished on the 9th of August 1942 in Auschwitz, having virtually just arrived off the train from the Netherlands and went straight to the gas chambers. And in the period prior to that, it's pretty clear that she actually was a great testimony, just a light in the midst of that darkness. And I'm pretty sure that in many situations we actually had Jewish followers of Jesus bringing some hope into that darkness.
Amazing. It's incredible, isn't it? And this is something that I think if we take a step back and look from this, and look from God's perspective, that here this is the greatest catastrophe that's ever befallen the Jewish people, the systematic industrial murder of the Jewish people on an industrial scale by the Nazis and by the Nazi regime. And yet in the midst of that darkness, God placed Messianic Jewish believers in that situation where they could minister, give hope and reassurance to other Jewish people, that many of them abandoned their faith, abandoned their belief in God because of the horrors of what they saw. So it's incredible to think that they went through that horrendous death, but they were there with the rest of the Jewish people.
I think that's the case. You don't have the evidence because these people were murdered, they died. But I think from what we've seen so far, I think there's every reason to believe that many people did bring a strong witness for the Lord in that dark place. And I think that brings us some hope. And I think if you want to try to learn something from this, I mean, the first thing I've learned is that what Jeremiah wrote in chapter 17, verse 9 is true. The heart is evil above all things and desperately wicked. Who can understand it? There's just a wickedness and an evil about this that my mind can't comprehend. But there is some light there. And I think, you know, that's what we actually have to home in. And that's the lesson we can learn for today. God forbid we'd ever have to go through a Holocaust or a terrible situation. Nobody should hope that. But if it does, my desire personally is that I'll be able to actually also be a testimony and witness and a light in the midst of that dark situation. I don't know how I'm going to respond. I think a lot of people like Corrie ten Boom and others, they probably didn't know how they would respond. It's just at the time. But you'd want that your faith would be so strong that in the midst of those dark times you would actually be a light. And I think that's what we sort of have to sort of desire to gain from this. Absolutely. As well as giving, in a sense, giving a voice to those Jewish followers of Jesus. I don't know if they've actually had much of a voice in the 80 years that have gone on since the Holocaust. And the desire, another desire of David Pileggi from the very beginning, it was his vision for many years, was to do this research. I think his desire has always been to give those people a voice.
Which is so important, and thankfully we're doing this on the programme today. But can you share with us, Kelvin, your trip to France in the summer of 2019, before COVID? None of us had any idea what would be happening a year later. On how God really connected you to various individuals in France so that you can find out more about what happened to Messianic Jews belonging to the French Jewish community, and how you uncovered their remarkable story. I know this is the material you're writing for your latest book.
How long we got?
I don't know. I'll find out from my producer, but probably about 12 to 15 minutes, I would say.
Well, it actually is quite an incredible little situation. I'm going to have to embarrass a couple of people here, and unfortunately, one of the people I might embarrass is the person who's.
We've got 13 minutes. There you go, 13 minutes.
Jane Moxon was heads up the work of CMJ in France, and she'd asked me to come along and speak at their conference. And I mean, who's going to pass up coming to France, you know? So, okay. But I said, listen, yes, okay, but on the condition that we can go to this place called Gurs. So her and Chris, her husband, checked out where Gurs was, and of course they found that's the bottom part of France. And so they said, no way, you're not going to go all the way down there. But I was quite insistent. Now the reason why I wanted to go to this place called Gurs is because I'd done some reading and about what was happening in the French situation, and I kept finding the name Gurs, G-U-R-S. And I thought, where is this Gurs? So I looked at the map, and it's right down the very bottom. And then I began to read some more, one particular testimony in particular, and this lady was a Jewish lady, a non-Aryan Christian, okay, that's why I was reading about her, from the western part of Germany. And lo and behold, they put onto a train and sent not east to Poland or anywhere, but sent to the southern part of France. And I thought, oh, they're sending them to a holiday camp or something. No, they're sending them to a detention camp in the southern part of France. And so, I mean, you've got to start thinking, what on earth are they doing? Sending Jewish people from the western part of Germany to the southern part of France. It just didn't make sense. And I just had to try to make some sense of something which didn't make sense. And that was part of this Madagascar plan. So that's when, you know, I first began to, well, I must have heard about the Madagascar plan before, but I just didn't comprehend. But on this occasion, I said, right, let's find out what this is all about. The Madagascar plan was quite serious, so this was just going to be the beginning point. Why send the Jewish people in that part of Germany elsewhere when they're going to go to Madagascar anyway? Send them to Poland, we're going to send them all the way back again. Send them down to the southern part of France to a detention camp, there were several. Gurs was the major one, in preparation for when we defeat the British, put them on the boats and we'll send them to Madagascar. So that was all part of the bigger plan. Now I'm just one of those funny creatures that I'm wired in a certain way that when I read something and I think it's quite important, I actually want to go out and experience it. I want to go and actually see it's real. I mean, when I was doing my military stuff, for instance, in Israel and the Light Horse and Allenby, etc., I'd want to go out to these way off places just to see it myself. So that was my ultimatum to Mr. and Mrs. Moxon. Yes, I'll come over and help you out with this conference, but the condition is. So anyhow, we got our plans going, so we started going down to the bottom part of France. And just a few weeks before, in the office of CMJ, there was a particular volunteer that was there. And I think Jane was talking about this crazy Australian who wants to go down to the bottom part of France. And this volunteer said something like, oh, which part of France? My mother lives in that part of France. And it so happens she lives about an hour away from this detention camp. But none of them had ever heard of this detention camp. So this particular lady who was working as a volunteer in the office said, well, you can go and stay at my mother's house. So that's what we did. But on the way down, we stopped at another place, and a very close friend of mine in Israel, Raphael Perodin was his name, he was French, and his wife Lydia. Well, Lydia's parents were living in this particular town, CMJUK, I think it was called, and we stopped in there, and Pierre, the father, who had been a pastor in the French Protestant church, said, so what are you going down there for? And I told him, so I used to be the Protestant minister in that town, and I once did a service at this place called Gurs.
Amazing. Wow. Okay,
so, wow, there we go. He gives us a contact. Off we go down there, and we went out to this place called Gurs, and it was all that. It was massive, mate, massive. Not much of it left, but you knew where it had been. But there's also a cemetery, because all the Jewish people who had died there, because they didn't get sent off to Madagascar. So they stayed there for quite a while before they were sent back to Germany and then to the death camps. So all those people who died, they've actually got tombstones. It's probably one of the only places where Jewish victims of the Holocaust actually have individual tombstones. Well over 1,000. It really is it's moving. It's really, really moving. And so we actually used that contact from Pierre, and we located this particular lady. For sensitivity's sake, I won't say any names. And through that, we actually were able to see some records of Jewish people who had actually been baptized in the camp, basically. And again, I can't give all the details of that at the moment. So there's lots of things that were happening. But that evening, back at this particular lady's house, whose daughter had been up in the headquarters of CMJ, they were part of this Protestant church, had a meeting. And the minister from the church was there. I think it was about 13 members, quickly came together. We had this impromptu service. And this minister had actually grown up and done his theological training in that region. So I gave my talk and told him about what we had done during the daytime. Do you know what? Not him, not one person from that congregation had ever heard that had been a detention camp in Gurs and that Jewish people had been incarcerated there during the war. That's incredible. None of them ever knew it. I thought, this is quite amazing. But there are other events which happened as a result of being there in France during that period of time. And I guess all I can say is we just have to wait till we finally get it in print, which hopefully will be sometime in the future.
We've got 7 minutes left of the programme. And Kelvin, I'm so pleased that you've been diligent, you followed the call of the Lord to really uncover the hidden story of the plight of the Messianic Jewish people in Europe during the Nazi occupation and then ultimately their deaths in the Holocaust. Now, for the Jewish Messianic believers, feel in a kind of difficult situation, aren't they? Because on the one hand, they are told by the Jewish community that they are not properly Jewish or part of the Jewish community. And then with the Gentile Christians, they're not considered Gentile Christians either, so they're stuck between the two, but they act as fantastic bridges between the two communities. What does this story mean for them now, knowing that their compatriots actually died in the Holocaust as Messianic Jews? And what message can they now bring, knowing that history and knowing that knowledge that their brothers and sisters who were Messianics perished at the hands of the Nazis as well in the most horrific way and went through the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau? I'm
really not the best person to ask. But I think you really do need to ask Messianic believers themselves. Two of my closest friends in Israel are Benjamin and Reuven Berger, who are pastors for the Messianic congregation at Christ Church in Jerusalem. And they are themselves children of Holocaust survivors. And I've had some conversations with them, and they're very, very happy that this is all being unearthed. But I do think you probably should, at some stage, just talk to some of themselves. You know, Richard Harvey, for instance, who lives here in the UK. Richard's been very interested in this and done some of his own work over many, many years. It would probably be good sometime just to ask them, well, what does it mean for them in this particular context. But I could well imagine that for a Jewish follower of Jesus, who's been told for so long that he doesn't belong anymore because of his faith in Jesus, I'm sure they could actually say, well, if I had been there in that period of time, my faith wouldn't have helped me. What I believe wouldn't have helped me. I would have still gone, I would still be murdered like every other Jewish person. So you saying that I'm not Jewish because I believe in Jesus when I would have been murdered alongside all the other Jewish people? That's how I imagine they could very well perceive it. But still, it's a question that I personally don't believe I can answer.
No, I appreciate that. I'm just thinking the kind of wider context now that your research has brought to life, something that has been hidden for generations, probably over 80 years. Very few people know about the plight of Messianic Jewish believers during the Holocaust. You've done the research, so you're now the expert on this subject because God's called you to this, because you know more than most people. I probably thought that there would be a few Messianic Jewish believers, or that some Jewish people would have reached out to the Messiah during that horrific time, because we know that God is a merciful and loving God in the midst of that darkness, and we know we're in the most darkest, desperate times. This is where God works the most. So it's amazing that he had his light, or his representatives, in the most horrific of all places. And they were the Nazi death camps. So drawing on from your research, your experience, how important is it that the Christians also educate themselves about the plight of Messianic Jews during the Holocaust?
Can I just give something I want to say there?
Yeah, of course.
I do not want to be regarded as an expert on this. There's been a few times in the past where I felt the Lord actually saying it's not how much you know, it's how willing you are to use the little that you do know. So the little that I do know on the subject matter is what I really want to bring out. There are some wonderful people, even Gershom Narell in Israel, for instance, and many others who have got lots of knowledge as well. So it's a combined effort, basically. But I do think it's very, very important for the Gentile church to be aware of the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
But also the smaller picture as well. International Holocaust Remembrance Day this year, we did an event in Perth, Western Australia, and oftentimes there is such an event. On this occasion, we actually did it in a Reformed church, and it was organised by a small group of us. We spoke about this subject matter, and the head of the Holocaust Institute for Western Australia came along, and he himself said afterwards, I have never heard of this whole concept, never heard of it before, of there being Jewish followers of Jesus who actually perished in the Holocaust. But also the Gentile Christians that were there. I think that to understand the Holocaust it's very difficult, but we must try to continually bring it before the attention of all people, because, listen, whatever happened way back then can very easily happen again.
Absolutely. We're down to less than 2 minutes of the programme, Kelvin. So what have you learned from these remarkable Messianic Jewish people that had to endure the horrors of the Holocaust and ultimately paid the ultimate price, and that was their life at the hands of the Nazis, and were murdered by Hitler's regime?
Well, as I mentioned before, what I've learned is Jeremiah was right. The heart is evil above all things and desperately wicked. Who can understand it? And it's our responsibility as followers of Jesus to be as close to the Lord as we can possibly be, and to pray continually that if and when such things happen again, we can also be a light in the midst of the darkness, as many of these people were.
Kelvin Crombie, it's been an absolute pleasure for have you back on the Middle East Report, and next time you're in the UK, you've got to come on the programme. I look forward to your new book about the plight of French Messianic Jews during the Holocaust. So
thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for watching this very special programme today, because who knew about the plight of Messianic Jewish believers, that they went through the Holocaust, and their story deserves to be told, and the church needs to be told about this incredible story about the plight and of the Messianic Jewish community and how they went through the Holocaust, and also to our Jewish friends as well need to know this very, very important story which has come to light at this time for a purpose. So I want to thank you for watching today's edition of the Middle East Report.